The first soul that Dr. Matthias Crow captured was that of a dying child in the winter of 1822, trapped within a peculiar glass orb that he kept locked away in his study like some twisted trophy of his supernatural experiments. By the spring of 1823, the good doctor had amassed a collection of 17 such orbs, each one glowing with a soft, otherworldly light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and each one containing the essence of someone whose final moments had been witnessed by Crow's calculating eyes. The town of Millfield, nestled in the hills of western Massachusetts, had no idea what manner of creature had taken up residence in the grand colonial mansion on Elm Street. To the townsfolk, Dr. Crow appeared to be nothing more than a learned physician who had arrived from Boston with impressive credentials and a remarkable ability to ease the suffering of the dying. What they didn't know was that their beloved doctor wasn't healing the sick, he was harvesting them, collecting their souls at the moment of death for purposes that went far beyond anything the human mind was meant to comprehend. The process had begun innocently enough, or so Crow told himself during those early days when he could still pretend his work served some noble purpose. He had discovered quite by accident that certain individuals possessed souls of unusual luminosity, spirits that glowed brighter than others when viewed through the special lens he had crafted from materials that shouldn't have existed in the natural world. These exceptional souls, he reasoned, were too precious to simply let slip away into whatever realm awaited the dead. Have you ever been around someone during their final moments and felt like something invisible left the room when they passed? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear about any experiences you've had with sensing something supernatural during times of death or serious illness. The collection had started with old Ezekiel Parsons, a farmer whose family had been among Millfield's first settlers. Parsons had been dying of consumption, his lungs failing as winter tightened its grip on the Massachusetts countryside. Crow had been called to ease the man's final hours, but as he watched Parsons draw his last breath, the doctor saw something that changed everything he thought he understood about death and the human spirit. Through his special lens, a circular piece of glass that seemed to bend light in impossible ways, Crow watched as a luminous essence rose from Parsons's body, a glowing orb of pure spiritual energy that hovered for just a moment above the corpse before beginning to drift toward whatever realm claimed the souls of the departed. Acting on instinct and curiosity that would later horrify him, Crow had reached out with a crystalline sphere he had been using for entirely different experiments and somehow managed to trap the essence before it could complete its journey. The captured soul writhed within its prison like a living thing, pulsing with light that seemed to communicate emotions Crow couldn't interpret but found strangely compelling. The orb grew warm in his hands, and he could feel the spiritual energy contained within it, resonating with something deep in his own consciousness. For the first time in his life, the doctor felt truly alive, as if Parsons's captured essence was somehow feeding his own spirit and expanding his awareness beyond normal human limitations. That first capture had been an impulse, a momentary yielding to scientific curiosity that Crow told himself was simply an extension of his medical research. But as the days passed and he studied the imprisoned soul, he began to understand that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a mere scientific curiosity. The captured essence seemed to be trying to communicate with him, showing him visions of realms that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. Through these supernatural revelations, Crow learned that souls were not simply the animating force of human bodies, but complex repositories of memory, experience, and spiritual energy that retained their consciousness even after physical death. More importantly, he discovered that these souls could be used for purposes that went far beyond their original function as the essence of individual human lives. The second soul he captured belonged to young Rebecca Thornfield, a seamstress who had taken ill with a fever that no earthly medicine could cure. Crow had attended her deathbed not as a healer, but as a harvester, watching through his special lens as her spirit prepared to depart her failing body. Rebecca's soul was particularly bright, glowing with a pure white light that suggested innocence and spiritual power that could prove useful for his growing collection. As with Parsons before her, Crow trapped Rebecca's essence in one of his crystalline spheres, but this time he was prepared for the supernatural experiences that followed. The captured soul showed him visions of the afterlife realms where human spirits normally traveled after death, revealing a complex hierarchy of spiritual dimensions that operated according to laws completely different from those governing the physical world. What fascinated Crow most was the discovery that these captured souls could be combined and manipulated, their spiritual energies blended together to create new forms of supernatural power that could be directed toward specific purposes. By merging portions of different souls within specially prepared vessels, he could create what he came to think of as spiritual tools, concentrated essences that could affect reality in ways that defied every known law of nature and science. The doctor's third capture was Reverend Silas Hartwell, the town's Methodist minister who had been Crow's most vocal supporter and closest confidant during the early months of his residency in Millfield. Hartwell had fallen victim to a wasting disease that gradually drained his strength while leaving his mind sharp and his faith unshaken. The Reverend had welcomed Crow's visits during his final illness, grateful for the comfort the doctor seemed able to provide during his darkest hours. But Hartwell's gratitude turned to horror when he realized what was actually happening during those bedside visits. On the night of his death, the Reverend's spiritual sensitivity allowed him to perceive Crow's true nature and the supernatural apparatus the doctor used to capture departing souls. With his dying breath, Hartwell tried to warn others about what Crow was doing, but his words were dismissed as the fevered ravings of a man whose mind had been affected by his illness. Hartwell's soul proved to be the most valuable addition to Crow's collection, glowing with the intense spiritual energy that came from a lifetime of religious devotion and connection to divine forces. When combined with the essences he had already captured, Hartwell's spirit provided the missing element that allowed Crow to begin experimenting with more ambitious, supernatural projects. The doctor discovered that by blending different souls in specific proportions, he could create spiritual compounds that granted him abilities no normal human should possess. A mixture combining portions of Parsons's earthbound practicality with Rebecca's innocent purity and Hartwell's divine connection allowed Crow to perceive supernatural phenomena that remained invisible to ordinary sight. He could see the spiritual auras that surrounded living people, identifying those whose souls would be most valuable for his collection. More disturbing still was Crow's growing realization that the captured souls retained their individual consciousness and were fully aware of what was being done to them. They tried to communicate with him through the crystalline vessels that held them prisoner, their desperate attempts at contact creating patterns of light and energy that the doctor learned to interpret as pleas for release or warnings about the consequences of his actions. But rather than feeling remorse for the suffering he was causing, Crow found himself fascinated by the complex emotional and spiritual responses of his captive souls. He began conducting experiments designed to test the limits of their awareness and the extent to which they could be manipulated or controlled. Some souls could be induced to provide visions of future events, while others revealed secrets about the living people they had once been, or the spiritual realms they had glimpsed during their brief moments between death and capture. As his collection grew, Crow's abilities expanded in ways that transformed him from a merely gifted physician into something that existed on the borderline between human and supernatural entity. He could predict with uncanny accuracy when someone was going to die, arriving at their bedside with perfect timing to capture their essence at the moment of departure. He could induce visions and spiritual experiences in living people by exposing them to controlled emanations from his captured souls. Most significantly, he discovered that he could extend his own life indefinitely by periodically absorbing small portions of the spiritual energy contained within his collection. The fourth soul to join Crow's collection was that of Martha Blackwood, a widow whose husband had died the previous autumn in a hunting accident. Martha had been one of the few people in Millfield who seemed suspicious of the doctor's uncanny ability to appear at deathbeds with such perfect timing. She had begun asking questions about his methods and background, expressing concerns to her neighbors about the strange lights that were sometimes visible in the windows of his mansion during the dark hours before dawn. Crow had dealt with Martha's suspicions by gradually poisoning her with substances that mimicked the symptoms of natural illness while remaining undetectable to other physicians who might be called in for consultation. As Martha's health declined, she became increasingly convinced that the doctor was responsible for her condition, but her accusations were dismissed by townsfolk who viewed Crow as their community's greatest benefactor. On the night of Martha's death, she managed to scratch a warning message into the wooden bed frame of her deathbed, but the words were discovered and erased by Crow before anyone else could read them. Martha's soul was particularly resistant to capture, fighting against the crystalline prison with an intensity that created sparks of spiritual energy, visible even without the doctor's special lens. Her essence retained an unusual degree of independence even after being trapped, occasionally managing to influence events in the physical world in small, but noticeable ways. By the summer of 1823, Crow's collection had grown to include the souls of 17 individuals, each one carefully selected for specific spiritual qualities that contributed to the doctor's expanding supernatural abilities. He had captured the essence of farmers and merchants, mothers and children, believers and skeptics, creating a diverse collection that provided him with access to a wide range of spiritual energies and supernatural capabilities. The doctor's mansion had been transformed into a sort of spiritual laboratory, where he conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries between life and death, between the physical and supernatural realms. The basement had been converted into a chamber, where the captured souls were stored in specially designed crystalline vessels, each one positioned to create geometric patterns that amplified their spiritual emanations. The walls were lined with mirrors that had been treated with substances derived from his soul collection, creating reflective surfaces that showed not just physical appearances, but the spiritual auras of anyone who looked into them. Visitors to the mansion reported feeling unusually tired after spending time in Crow's presence, as if something vital had been drained from them during their encounters with the doctor. Children were particularly affected, often complaining of nightmares after visits to the mansion, dreams filled with images of glowing orbs and voices calling to them from impossible distances. Several families began avoiding the doctor altogether, preferring to risk illness and death rather than expose themselves to whatever force seemed to emanate from his person and property. But Crow's growing power came with unexpected consequences that he had not anticipated when he began his collection. The captured souls, despite being imprisoned within their crystalline vessels, retained connections to the spiritual realms they had been prevented from entering. These connections created supernatural disturbances that affected the entire town of Millfield, manifestations that grew more intense as the collection expanded. Residents began reporting encounters with apparitions that resembled deceased family members and friends, but these phantoms behaved in ways that suggested they were not the peaceful spirits of the departed. Instead, they seemed angry and desperate, trying to communicate warnings about dangers that the living couldn't understand. Some of these ghostly figures were recognized as people whose deaths had been attended by Dr. Crow, though none of the witnesses made the connection between the apparitions and the doctor's supernatural activities. The spiritual disturbances centered around the mansion on Elm Street, where residents reported seeing lights moving behind the windows at all hours of the night, accompanied by sounds that resembled human voices, but spoke in languages that predated any known human civilization. The very air around the property seemed to shimmer with energy that made sensitive individuals feel nauseated and disoriented, while animals refused to approach the building or the grounds surrounding it. Crow's experiments had begun attracting the attention of supernatural entities that existed in the realms between life and death, beings that viewed his soul collection as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be claimed for their own purposes. These entities began manifesting in and around Millfield, their presence creating additional disturbances that made the town an increasingly uncomfortable place to live. The first of these supernatural visitors appeared to Crow in his study on a hot August night, when the air hung still and heavy over the Massachusetts countryside. The entity manifested as a figure that seemed to be composed of shadows and starlight, constantly shifting between human and abstract forms that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. It spoke in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, offering Crow knowledge and power beyond anything he had yet imagined in exchange for access to his collection of captured souls. The shadow entity revealed that Crow's activities had been noticed by intelligences that existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception, beings that had been collecting and trading spiritual essences for purposes that spanned millennia and involved the manipulation of reality on scales that dwarfed anything the Doctor had attempted. These entities offered to teach Crow techniques for soul capture and manipulation that would make his current method seem primitive by comparison, but only if he agreed to share his collection and submit to their guidance in future activities. Crow found himself torn between his desire for greater power and his reluctance to surrender control over the collection he had worked so hard to assemble. The captured souls seemed to sense the presence of the shadow entity and responded with increased agitation, their crystalline prisons glowing more brightly as they tried to communicate warnings about the dangers of accepting the supernatural visitor's offer. As the Doctor deliberated over the entity's proposition, additional supernatural beings began manifesting in and around his mansion, each one representing different factions or interests in the complex hierarchy of beings that existed beyond normal human awareness. Some appeared as angels of terrible beauty, who spoke of divine justice and the need to release the imprisoned souls to their proper destinations. Others manifested as demonic figures that offered even greater power in exchange for helping them corrupt and claim the spiritual essences for their own dark purposes. The competing supernatural influences created a state of spiritual warfare that centered around Crow's mansion and gradually spread throughout Millfield. Residents began experiencing prophetic dreams, supernatural visions, and encounters with entities that defied rational explanation. The boundary between the physical world and the spiritual realms became increasingly thin, allowing phenomena from both sides to manifest with growing frequency and intensity. Children throughout the town began displaying abilities that their parents couldn't understand or control. Some could see and communicate with the dead, while others seemed to be able to influence physical objects through force of will alone. Adults found themselves compelled to visit the mansion on Elm Street, despite having no conscious desire to do so, drawn by supernatural influences that operated below the level of rational thought. The crisis reached its peak on the night of September 21, 1823, when all the competing supernatural forces converged on Crow's mansion in an attempt to claim his collection of captured souls. The Doctor found himself at the center of a battle between entities whose true nature and motivations remained beyond his comprehension, each faction seeking to either destroy or control the spiritual essences he had gathered. The shadow entity that had first approached Crow manifested in his study with greater solidity and intensity than ever before, offering him one final opportunity to accept its protection in exchange for surrendering half of his collection. The angelic beings appeared simultaneously, their radiant presence filling the mansion with light that revealed the true horror of what the Doctor had been doing to the souls under his control. The demonic entities materialized in the basement chamber where the crystalline vessels were stored, their dark influence causing the imprisoned souls to writhe in agony as spiritual energies that had been carefully balanced for months began to destabilize. Crow realized that his supernatural experiments had grown beyond his ability to control or understand, that he had become a pawn in conflicts between forces that viewed human consciousness and spiritual essence as nothing more than resources to be harvested and manipulated. The souls in his collection, sensing that their imprisonment was about to end one way or another, began trying to break free from their crystalline prisons, their combined spiritual energy creating resonances that threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. As the supernatural battle raged around him, Crow made a desperate decision that would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of every soul he had captured. Rather than surrender his collection to any of the competing factions, he began a ritual designed to merge all 17 captured essences with his own spiritual energy, creating a hybrid entity that would possess the combined power of all the souls while remaining under his personal control. The ritual required Crow to shatter each crystalline vessel in sequence, while absorbing the released spiritual energy into his own consciousness. The process was agonizing, as each absorbed soul brought with it not just power, but the memories, emotions, and personalities of the individuals he had murdered and imprisoned. Ezekiel Parsons's earthbound wisdom, Rebecca Thornfield's innocent faith, Reverend Hartwell's divine connection, Martha Blackwood's righteous anger, all of it flooded into Crow's awareness, threatening to overwhelm his individual identity and transform him into something that was no longer entirely human. But the transformation also granted him supernatural abilities that exceeded anything he had previously imagined. He could perceive the true nature of the entities that surrounded him, understanding their motivations and the broader cosmic conflicts in which they were engaged. He could manipulate spiritual energy with precision that allowed him to reshape reality according to his will, creating effects that defied every known law of physics and metaphysics. The competing supernatural factions, recognizing that Crow had become something beyond their ability to control or destroy, withdrew from direct confrontation and began attempting to influence him through more subtle means. The shadow entity offered him knowledge of other soul collectors throughout history, promising to teach him techniques that would allow him to expand his activities on a global scale. The angelic beings appealed to whatever remained of his human conscience, showing him visions of the suffering he had caused and the spiritual damage that resulted from preventing souls from reaching their intended destinations. The demonic entities tempted him with promises of unlimited power and immortality, revealing that his current collection was merely the beginning of what could be accomplished through the systematic harvesting and manipulation of human spiritual essence. They showed him visions of futures where he ruled over vast empires of the dead, commanding armies of captured souls and conflicts that spanned multiple dimensions and involved the reshaping of reality according to his desires. Crow found himself overwhelmed by the competing influences and the weight of the 17 individual personalities that now shared his consciousness. Each captured soul retained its individual identity while being merged with his own, creating a chaotic internal dialogue that made rational thought increasingly difficult. Ezekiel Parsons demanded to know why his peaceful death had been interrupted and his soul prevented from reaching its intended rest. Rebecca Thornfield wept for the family she would never see again in whatever realm awaited the properly departed dead. Reverend Hartwell preached about divine justice and the consequences of interfering with God's plan for human souls. The internal conflict between Crow's original personality and the absorbed souls created external manifestations that transformed the mansion on Elm Street into a supernatural maelstrom that affected the entire town of Millfield. Windows throughout the building began glowing with different colors of spiritual energy, each one representing the essence of a different captured soul. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with combined life force of 18 different individuals, creating architectural impossibilities as rooms expanded and contracted according to the emotional states of the merged consciousness within. Residents of Millfield found themselves drawn to the mansion, despite every rational instinct telling them to flee from whatever had taken up residence there. The building called to them with voices they recognized: deceased family members, lost friends, spiritual guides that promised answers to questions about life and death that had haunted humanity since the beginning of consciousness. But those who ventured too close discovered that the voices belonged not to the peaceful dead, but to something that had been corrupted by its association with forces beyond human understanding. The town's children were particularly susceptible to the mansion's supernatural influence, experiencing shared dreams in which they walked through corridors that changed with each step and encountered rooms filled with crystalline vessels that pulsed with trapped starlight. In these dreams, the children could hear the voices of the captured souls, each one telling a different story about the moment of their death and the terrible realization that they had been prevented from continuing their spiritual journey. Some of the children began sleepwalking toward the mansion during the dark hours before dawn, drawn by compulsions they couldn't understand or resist. Parents who tried to prevent these nocturnal journeys found themselves unable to wake their children or physically restrain them, as if the supernatural forces emanating from Crow's collection could override normal parental authority and influence. The crisis reached its climax when 3 children, siblings from the Whitmore family, managed to enter the mansion during one of their supernatural trances and encountered the transformed Dr. Crow in his study. The children found him seated at his desk, his physical form constantly shifting between human appearance and something that resembled a living constellation of captured souls. His eyes held the depth of 17 different personalities, each one trying to communicate through the same set of features, creating expressions that changed so rapidly they seemed to blur together into something that hurt to look at directly. Crow tried to speak to the children, but the words that emerged from his mouth belonged to different captured souls, creating a chorus of voices that spoke simultaneously about death, imprisonment, and the terrible hunger for spiritual freedom that consumed the merged consciousness. Ezekiel Parsons' practical farmer's dialect, mixed with Rebecca Thornfield's gentle manner of speech and Reverend Hartwell's biblical quotations, while Martha Blackwood's angry accusations provided a counterpoint that turned the communication into something resembling a supernatural argument. The children, still in their trance-like state, seemed to understand what they were witnessing in ways that their normal waking consciousness never could have comprehended. They saw through Crow's physical form to perceive the 17 captured souls writhing within his transformed essence, each one desperate to break free from the spiritual prison that their captor had created through his final ritual. But they also perceived something else, a growing instability in the supernatural structure that Crow had created, a fundamental incompatibility between the different spiritual essences that suggested the merged consciousness could not maintain its current form indefinitely. The captured souls were fighting not just against their imprisonment, but against each other, their different personalities and spiritual orientations creating conflicts that threatened to tear apart the artificial unity that held them together. The children's presence seemed to accelerate this process of spiritual dissolution, their innocent souls serving as catalysts that revealed the true horror of what Crow had accomplished through his collection activities. One by one, the captured essences began to separate from the merged consciousness, each soul glowing more brightly as it regained its individual identity and prepared to complete the journey that had been interrupted by Crow's supernatural intervention. As the spiritual structure collapsed, the mansion on Elm Street began to shake and groan with architectural stresses that defied every law of physics and engineering. Rooms that had been expanded beyond their normal dimensions snapped back to their original proportions, while corridors that had been twisted into impossible configurations straightened themselves with sounds like breaking bones. The crystalline vessels that had once contained the captured souls shattered simultaneously, releasing bursts of spiritual energy that illuminated the entire building with light that could be seen for miles in every direction. Dr. Matthias Crow's physical form couldn't survive the separation of the spiritual essences that had become merged with his consciousness. As each captured soul broke free and resumed its interrupted journey toward whatever realm awaited the properly dead, Crow aged rapidly, his body reflecting the true cost of the supernatural experiments he had conducted over the past year. His hair turned white, his skin wrinkled and sagged, and his eyes lost the terrible depth that had contained 17 different personalities. In his final moments, Crow experienced the memories and emotions of every person whose soul he had captured, understanding for the first time the full magnitude of the suffering he had caused through his supernatural activities. He felt Ezekiel Parsons' confusion at being prevented from joining his deceased wife in whatever realm awaited faithful souls. He experienced Rebecca Thornfield's terror at being trapped in a crystalline prison while her family mourned her loss. He shared Reverend Hartwell's spiritual anguish at being used as a tool for supernatural experiments that violated every principle of divine justice. The released souls departed the mansion with a sound like wind chimes made of starlight, their spiritual energy creating aurora-like displays in the sky above Millfield that could be seen throughout the Connecticut River Valley. Each soul paused for a moment at the threshold between worlds, looking back at the transformed doctor with expressions that contained not hatred, but a profound sadness for what he had become through his pursuit of supernatural power. As the last captured soul completed its interrupted journey, the mansion on Elm Street returned to its normal architectural proportions, but the building remained forever changed by its exposure to spiritual forces that exceeded anything the material world was designed to contain. The walls retained impressions of the supernatural events that had occurred within them, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly presence that made the structure uninhabitable for normal human occupancy. Dr. Crow's body was found the next morning by the 3 Whitmore children, who had awakened from their supernatural trance with clear memories of everything they had witnessed during the night. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though local physicians couldn't explain why the doctor appeared to have aged decades in a single night, or why his personal papers contained detailed records of supernatural experiments that seemed to belong in works of fiction rather than scientific documentation. The mansion was abandoned and eventually demolished, but residents of Millfield continued to report supernatural activities in the area where it had once stood. Visitors to the empty lot sometimes claimed to see lights moving beneath the ground, as if spiritual energy continued to emanate from whatever remained of Crow's supernatural laboratory. Children playing in the vicinity occasionally reported hearing voices that seemed to come from below their feet, speaking in languages they couldn't understand, but which filled them with inexplicable feelings of sadness and longing. The story of Dr. Crow and his collection of souls became a local legend that was passed down through generations of Millfield families. Though most residents preferred not to discuss the events that had transformed their quiet town into the site of supernatural activities that challenged everything they thought they understood about life, death, and the nature of human consciousness. But those who knew where to look and what signs to watch for claimed that evidence of Crow's activities could still be found scattered throughout the area. Crystalline fragments that glowed with inner light when exposed to darkness, mirrors that reflected not just physical forms, but the spiritual auras of anyone who looked into them, and documents written in languages that seemed to shift and change when examined too closely. Some said that Crow himself had not truly died, but had been transformed into something that existed in the spaces between life and death, forever searching for new souls to add to a collection that could never again be contained within the limitations of physical reality. On certain nights when the boundary between worlds grew thin, sensitive individuals claimed to see a figure walking through Millfield streets, examining the spiritual auras of sleeping residents and making notes in a ledger that seemed to be written with light instead of ink. If this terrifying tale of a doctor who collected souls for supernatural experiments gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling historical horror stories.